started talking about Soma last night, the thing that really stood out to me is it's kind of the same conversation that vloggers have about the responsibility to the message and to the previous videos. Like, I think if you put something out there, like this is the age-old conversation about it, isn't it? Like, if you put something out of there, are you responsible for it in some way? Like, and if your views change beyond that, like how can I say this? What responsibility do you have to your future or previous self? And I think that, like, that's what stood out to me there when we were talking yesterday about Soma and the ending of it in particular. And like the journey of someone going through it. Like, some guy just like starting off making funny videos on the internet and then like progresses to a higher stage and then to a higher stage and a higher stage. What responsibility do you have to your future you and to your past you?
Yeah, it's almost like your past self is responsible for your future self, but are you as the future self responsible for your past self? Like, there's that disconnect there, right? Because as the past self, your experiences that you're currently forming will impact how you become your future self. But who you are right now doesn't reflect who you were 10 years ago or even a month ago. So,
yeah.
I mean, of course, we can start arguing things like, oh, is that even you 1 month ago? Is that the you now? Obviously, it's not, but it's more just how people look at it. And then when you start bringing consciousness into it, if you think of consciousness, it's like how I mentioned to you, there's this weird line of like consent, especially if you actually bring in these different slices of who we were into the same space. Even if they weren't two separate beings, just like as sets of memory, who are they? I don't know how else to say it. Like, there's so many. The unfortunate thing about I guess this game and this topic is there's so much to unpack. Like, where do you even start?
There's one argument or one story element, where I really want to start because it kind of pisses me off. The characters frame the chance of a consciousness being the right consciousness as a flip of the coin.
Yeah.
But that's still just straight up not how it works.
Yes.
For me, you create the side-by-side divergent path, and the only correlation they have to a coin is that they're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
No matter what you flip it, there's no chance, like, if you view it as that way, like I got the bad end and the other one got the good ends, then, I mean, I guess in the frame of these characters, you have to break some eggs to make an omelet, and we're the eggs that got broken, are the shells, I guess. So to speak.
So it's interesting because I thought the exact same thing when I first played the game. I was like, I don't understand why these characters keep referencing this flip of the coin thing. And so there's a lot of debates about it online. It gets, like, I guess, pretty heavy into philosophy. I think what the characters are trying to say, and again, these are characters, so one thing that I think some people struggle with when playing this game is that there is a disconnect between what you may philosophically believe and what maybe the world at large believes versus what these characters believe, because these characters are fallible. Like, they're people. Their beliefs may not match up with reality. And even ourselves, we can't perfectly understand consciousness anyway. We don't have all the details necessary. So we can't know ourselves. We can only do our best guess. What I think the whole terminology of the flip of the coin is actually trying to say is not in a linear sequence of like, oh, when that copy is made, that the other person, whichever person you are is a flip of a coin in a sequential linear timeline. It's more in the cosmic grand scale of existence, of the entire space-time, I guess, that it is a flip of a coin. Which one do you get to experience as you? It could have been either. You could have happened to be the person that ends up experiencing the copy, but you also, on the other hand, could have experienced instead the original. And that is decided based on basically a flip of a coin on a cosmic scale. I guess it gets more like either you could look at it in two ways. You either look at it from a physics perspective, or you look at it from a philosophical perspective. From a philosophical perspective, like you could only experience one or the other. You don't get to experience both. So by that margin, it is a flip of a coin. Yes, you don't get, like, if you are the person being copied, you will never get to experience the other person. There's no flip of a coin there. It's already been decided. The timeline of the universe is decided. You were the first person to experience that original being. But like when you kind of zoom out and think of when that copy is made, the copy also kind of feels like they were the original person. They retain all the memories of that original person. So
yeah,
it's, you know, who's to say, like, from the experience of the person, it still kind of feels like a flip of coin, because that point, that right there, when the copy is being done, they're identical beings in terms of consciousness. It may have already been predetermined. It's weird, but do you kind of see what I'm trying to say?
I kind of get I mean, I guess what you're saying. I get it, but I don't really buy into the concept of predetermination in general. Overall, I don't believe that things were predetermined. I think the things that develop and then are affected and it's happening currently, like a machine code running. You can see it happen live. The whole game is actually, part of the game is interested in algorithms and what are the limitations and the strictness of algorithms and its effect on helping and saving and determining. Like, it has like this very basic element of how can a machine know what a human experience? Like, get out of here. And then it ties that so hard to. It ties it so hard to this idea with the split consciousness. Now one's in a machine. Is that machine even the same thing? Is that hard? Are you now a set of algorithms now that you've been scanned and copied? But during the courses of the game, we're already a copy of a copy of a copy. We've been like driven into a bunch of different data systems, bunch of in and out of a bunch of different organic bodies. There's morphing that happens, I'm assuming, and different experiences that have accumulated if we want to get to that level. But in the end, what we're experiencing, what the game is experiencing, is it tries to say that this is the same consciousness that it started with.
Yeah.
That everything else that consciousness has experienced. But I suppose that presupposes that the data itself has not degraded or changed or been altered in some way.
Well,
and I find that part really interesting.
There were a few comments throughout the game. I remember, I think it was Catherine mentioned that Simon's scan from I think it was 2015 in Toronto. It's a flatter scan.
13.
So it was. It still functioned, but it was flatter. And there were times I remember where Simon kind of felt like it's like everything was still there, but he felt more hollow almost. And another comment I guess I'd make is like, even if the details are flatter, would the person experiencing that, all of it, would they even know? Because fundamentally their consciousness is flatter. They wouldn't know what they're missing, right? Only people around them who could literally dissect, like, between the original Simon and the copied Simon, only they could tell what feels more flat in their personality and in the way they experience things. But even then, you may not be able to anyway, because if it's on an experience level, I don't know that the copied Simon could tell the difference between being in his real body and who he is now. Because he only has one frame of reference. Even his memories of himself when he was alive is in a flatter copy of data. So even recalling those memories would be flatter than his real self. So his frame of reference is like, it's like a black box. He can't go back to see, do I feel different than I am now? He wouldn't be able to. But
I actually love this as a story for games in particular, because I think everything you said about the experience being flatter and not different is indicative of what a new person comes into experience in this game. No matter what, we're never going to have the same kind of rich experience the developers have, the level designers have, the asset makers have, the narrative designers have with this game. We're going to get this. Well, I mean, if you're like me, you're probably going to play once and then have that snapshot, and it's not going to have all the nuance and texture. And if you keep going back to it, of course, it's going to gain a bit more. What I find so interesting is how they kept accomplishing this through the game. And I was actually pretty upset and annoyed most of the time when I experienced a new puzzle or a new mechanic or something that I didn't understand. And it took you kind of unlocking that thought for me last night to develop this next thought, which is, of course they wanted to do that. I think it was part of their story to that Simon's kind of average. He's a little out of touch. He feels like the game feels like it doesn't want me to understand how instinctively how to do everything. I have to reassess and readdress the environment, the different kinds of puzzles we get. From like it seems like every new area and then 2 sections in that area had a different kind of thing that I needed to resolve, and some themes came back, but I found anytime I had to interact with the UI element to solve something, it was always a different puzzle. It was always a different set of mechanics, and I find that to be a very good indicator of how the system was built after the narrative.
There's actually something I want to talk about, but I want to return to this because I think it's a very interesting topic. The first thing I wanted to say, going back to what we were talking about before, would you agree that I think the statement this game is trying to make, and there was a point you made, and I can't quite remember it, but I remembered when you were talking about something that I think... Oh, that's right. So you were saying how throughout the entire game, it's the same. You're the same person. That's the way it feels. That's the way it plays. That's the way Simon experiences it. He doesn't feel like he's not the first Simon, the original Simon. Nothing about that changes. But what I think the statement of the game is, if it does have any statement on the narrative, is that your environment is what makes humanity. Like, whether or not you're in a robot or you're in an original body, I don't think any of that matters. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I got away from it. Like, I think if Simon was in an android body, but was surrounded by his friends, he was surrounded by humans, he was surrounded by the environment he was used to, is he not human? Does he not feel human? I guess you could start getting to little details of like, oh, I can't feel my flesh anymore. And, those things, they are part of the human...
That is the human experience.
Yes.
You were about to say
it is part of the human experience, but is it part of humanity? Because our view of what humanity is always going to change. I mean...
Well, it's not humanity, though, is it, at this point? We're helping humanity evolve as androids and lost robots. All of us, we meet the last human towards the end of the game.
No, of course. I'm not saying that what Simon was experiencing throughout the game was what he felt was humanity. But it was actually the lack of all of that showed that he didn't feel human anymore, not because he was a robot, but because he wasn't surrounded by anything familiar. The entire environment, the entire situation that he was thrown into was completely alien to him. So because of that, like, there was no reminder of humanity to him. And if anything, the game is him searching for humanity, really. Like, whether that's going onto the Ark, it's trying to get back to that place of familiarity. So I really do think that the game is trying to tell us that consciousness... Like, we all don't really understand it, but if we do understand one thing, I think it's that our memories and what we're familiar with is really what kind of is the catalyst for how we define our human experience. I think if everyone, started to have like cybernetic arms and stuff, there would be some people who would start to say, hey, we're not human anymore. But is that really true? Like, if we start to bit by bit replace our bodies with something else, but we still feel the same, but we all have the same culture and everything, is that not human anymore? And
the classic ship.
Yeah, exactly. And even if the culture is the same, even if the culture is different, 100 years ago our culture was completely different. Were we not human then? Are we not human now?
I think for me, this is... I might disagree with this.
Okay.
Not in spirit. I think this is one of the messages and an important part of the game. How we perceive where humanity is, I think, is the other part. There was a prevailing thought in the back of my head every time I got to a new location that made me look around and look up and consider, this is the key question. This is where humanity is right now. Look how far we've come. Look at we're under the ocean. We have established spaces. We have merged biotech with humanity and robots and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We have conscious bodies, like, and different machines, and they can expound on how they feel.
Mm-hmm.
They feel like they have arms and legs because that is the closest attachment they can make, neurologically speaking. I guess, like, neural pathways is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So there's, for me, it's more of a comment on how we feel about evolution and how we feel about what came before us.
Yeah.
And before us, excuse me. And I can't help but think, like, every time we got somewhere new, I'm like, wow, this is incredible what they've done and how they've, like, interacted with each other. And then we went down even further into I think it's the Mariana Trench, right? Like, way down to the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah. I'm not sure on the name, but it was
deep as we can go.
Yeah, it was the abyss.
The abyss, I think, would be the best way to describe it. I think of the trench because I think it is the deepest part of the ocean that we've discovered.
Yeah.
But I feel like that it's just going down there, and even though, like, we had that moment with Ross coming in and being like, "Oh, you've made it. I'll make the preparations." I still felt like I was an adventurer. I was still exploring new horizons. As for the first time coming as a guy from 2013, 2014 into this future, I was having the same experience he was having.
Yeah.
So I find it a little difficult to say that what you suggested was the core of the gameplay, because there's also a curiosity that is still unending in humanity. That's part of it. And I don't exactly buy that the definition of humanity is the singular static statement. I think there has to be a more dynamic explanation that allows us to evolve. We have to evolve. We have to change. We don't have a choice.
I think I definitely agree that it cannot be a static statement, and definitely not singular either. However, I still think that there is something to be said for one of the core aspects of humanity, as we perceive it. Really, even if you just get rid of humanity, the word humanity, if you perceive anything is based on our familiarity. What a dog might be familiar with as dogs or its own kind, if they can perceive that, is based on what they're familiar with. There's, I remember there was that case, I can't remember it. I don't know all the details, but I remember there was like a young child who like lived with dogs or wolves for a while, and that was crazy. And that her familiarity of what humanity is, or of course she might not be thinking about this at the time, but like everything she is familiar with is just based on her environment and what was around her and how she grew up. So
you can observe this in babies in COVID time now. There's some who have been in COVID more than they've been out. So when they get outside and start seeing other children, they have the same expressions, the same thought to it.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, I don't want to get stuck on this point. I just think it's interesting, and either way, the fact that we can have sort of different answers on it hopefully speaks for the range of the topics that can spur from this game, which I think is one of the strongest points of it. Like, regardless of the game design or the narrative, like, even if you didn't like the narrative or you didn't like the gameplay, I think it's a game you can talk about a lot. Absolutely. Like, I at least think that way. But let's get to, because you mentioned that the puzzles are different, like, each time.
Yeah. Well, more to the point. Simon was average, was the topic that made me think about all of this. I was very unsatisfied with the ending. I was very annoyed with Simon at the two major points. Where he makes copies of himself, and then one copy gets shut down, or at least in one case it does or doesn't. Yeah. It blew me away that we end up with Simon on the Ark as the post-credit sequence, and we have no attention to Simon coming back up from the abyss to meet other Simon and have that moment there. To me, that would be a stronger ending, because we have to grapple with two Simons having different experiences. Maybe not a stronger ending, a different ending. It felt a little trite that we're now forgetting everything we left behind in favor of new humanity, which is maybe the core choice of the game, right? Do we destroy what we leave behind, or do we move on? That's what many of the characters were concerned about, right? Yeah,
definitely.
Do we stop previous existence to move on to our new evolution? Do we have a successful transfer? And I walked in not believing that a transfer of consciousness was possible. If you make a copy, now you have two copies of the same seed out there in the world.
I want to get a little more into the details of, like, why that is the way it is. Because if you think of computers and data storage, right? Even if you transfer something from one hard drive to another, what you're essentially doing is copying the data onto another hard drive, and then you would be deleting it on the first one. There is no such thing as, like, transferring, I guess, like, at the lowest molecular level, like the charges or something, the electrons or whatever, into the other hard drive. I don't think that's something, like, at least right now, that's
bit to bit, atom to
atom. Like, we can't, unless you had a way to literally physically move the atoms to another hard drive, maybe that would be possible, but from the technology that I don't know of, that's not really something we can currently do. So I think that's, like, what it was trying to explore, that, like, even if, for example, Catherine, when she transferred to the suit, she transferred Simon to the new suit, right? Even if she, in the background, did a, like, cut and paste, technically it would have been a deletion anyway. Regardless. Simon wouldn't have known any different, which is kind of funny. But the same principle would have been in action, that realistically it is a cut and paste, and the original data has been deleted, so there's no getting around that, unfortunately.
It's so core. It's the key part of the story. And it's hard, because when I was going through the game, this was not an element I really picked up on through the suicide notes, through the journals and the data logs. I was more interested in, so people think they have to kill themselves to go on to Utopia. So there's a bit of the horror culty extra element that for me muddies the rest of the philosophy to it. Especially this core point, where we already have, like, what feels like horrific sci-fi and some intangible thing working against us, which perhaps at a meta level is where I'm getting confused. If you look at the text without outside consideration of how this kind of media is perceived, as in the including elements of horror, elements of supernatural and sci-fi, because it felt supernatural in its sense. It didn't feel as robotic, especially Ross. Ross looked like an amnesia monster and less like a part robot android thing. He moved like a Spider-Man type of deal.
Yeah.
And to me, that was more confusing as a thematic choice than sticking to something that was recognizably data and machine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could have seen that for some of the and that comes down to the core choice of how they wrote the narrative of the WoW, and it did feel a bit supernatural. I guess the element they were playing with is that, it's a future. This is clearly a very advanced technology. It seems to be like nanomachines to some degree. It's like goo that can just assemble itself into any way it wants. That's kind of the way that I took, at least. But then there were some things that were like, wait, but Ross can kind of like teleport? How does that work?
Right.
The only thing I could think of is that maybe they're not actually teleporting. It's like electromagnetism, like interference.
There's a virus in the system. That's what it is. I hadn't really thought about this.
Yeah.
Does Ross actually exist in this space? He only makes one physical interaction at the end.
Yeah,
of the
when
game,
he quote unquote dies, right?
Right. But does he? I mean,
that's an interesting
he
thought.
screams thing. Does he actually exist? He's in the mainframe already, so to speak.
Yeah.
But are we perceiving him? Because I don't think Catherine ever acknowledges that Ross is around. Actually, Catherine did, didn't she?
Okay.
We're going down to
Okay, sorry, just to get into crazy theory territory for a second.
All right.
Because you gave me like a really interesting idea. You know how after the Ross died, the WoW kind of was like almost mourning him? What if Ross, as in the Ross that we saw, is almost like a manifestation of the WoW? Because again, you're hooked up to the WoW. You were created by the WoW, whether you wanted it or not.
What if the WoW's algorithm is disagreeing with it?
Yeah, like what if it's almost like it's created this manifestation of Ross in order to destroy itself. It's almost a cry out for help from itself. That's weird.
That's so interesting. That is where I can, like, if we start marrying that concept to the different data, and then essentially, I love the algorithm because I like it more now, having put these pieces together as Lisa's headcanon. Because the algorithm is copying itself, right, from machine to machine.
Yeah.
We can say that like either it's connected or it's not connected to the core. So software has to update, right? Things have to be connected in some kind of way, and if they aren't, they adapt on their own.
Yeah.
So that's why we get such a different experience from the kinds of machines and the kinds of things we have. They've adapted in different ways based on their connection to the central WoW.
Almost evolution at work, but very sped up almost.
Definitely.
That I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time. I never thought of that the entire time because it is interesting to me. I mean, apart from the whole teleportation thing.
What did the WoW want? Did we ever figure that out?
No.
Just survival? Did we ever figure out what its parameters are for humanity?
So there's a lot of talk about this.
Or preservation? Okay. I haven't heard anything.
So for me, right, funnily enough, when I got to that scene where like Ross faces you and he's like, hey, you need to stick your arm in it and kill the WoW. I didn't even think it was a choice. I was just like, oh, is this the ending? I thought it was the ending of the game. I actually thought that when you put your arm in, you were just going to get swallowed up and die. And I'm like, damn, that's a morbid ending. Wow. But I regretted the choice after, because after really thinking about it, what I really think happened was that, of course, the parameters given to WoW of like what humanity is was not perfect. But if I think of machine learning and how machine learning actually works, the way it works is that it basically keeps trying stuff, right? And then it compares against a reference, a discriminator, I believe it is. And then after lots and lots of tries, the discriminator, I might be messing up all these terms, but these are just kind of what I remember off the top of my head. The discriminator will give it a value of like how successful you were, of getting close to that intended reference. So I actually think that the WoW, this entire game and this entire journey throughout the Pathos 2 station was really just trying. It was just really genuinely trying to save humanity of what it thought. And the thing is, machine learning, it doesn't think. It just does. It repeats actions. Yeah. It compares against a reference of what its parameters were.
I saw that meme today. It was like, hi, I'm a machine learning analyst. And like, great. What's 1 + 2? It's 4. No, it's 5. No, it's 1. No, it's like, then you figure it out.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like, you're hired. Great job.
Yeah, and the thing is that I really think that the WoW may have actually been the best chance for some form, of course not what we would necessarily consider humanity, but some form close enough to humanity. Think in 1,000 years, right? Like, eventually, it would find a way to get pretty close to what humanity is, the vision of humanity. It could even look at all the what's it called? The recordings on on cameras on the walls of like what humans looked like and how they interacted and how they talked to each other. It could have repeated looking over that footage over and over again, give it 1,000 years. And imagine if it just used like that black goo eventually to just create what is pretty much a perfect replica of at least what humans looked and behaved like. And then it could transfer the minds that it had through the scans into these new bodies. And I regret the choice to kill WoW. I really think that Ross was too hot-headed and thinking too short-term. This is the stage where machine learning gets everything wrong. Give it a couple 100 years to get things right. You know?
But then we get into this territory, which then Ross, I'm sure, was considering. If someone is in pain and suffering and are on some kind of life support unwillingly.
That's true.
Do you pull the plug or not? Do you give them that autonomy, or you're like, you know what, you're part of the eggs that crack?
Yeah. And you as Simon even went through this of bringing Brandon 1 back to life for multiple times and then shutting him down again. Do we have the right to spontaneously bring into existence consciousness, even if it's for a quote-unquote good purpose, right? Like us getting security cipher or the WoW trying to restore humanity? Is all the potential thousands of years of torture, which the WoW doesn't care about torture. It has no feelings. It doesn't think about anything. It's just trying to finish its objective. Is that really worth it?
It's impossible with incomplete information. With complete information, I have to say I would not support the suffering, find another way.
Yeah.
And that would be the end of it for me, for that conversation. I would have to say to Catherine, this is... First off, Brandon wasn't human in that. He was data by then.
No, but it was still consciousness.
It was still what we can assume is consciousness now, based on what we have in native. Like, I feel like it is. Like, I feel like this is an autonomous AI.
It would at the very least, in my opinion, be just as conscious as whatever Simon the copy was.
Absolutely. Yeah. I absolutely agree with that. And it hurt to do that. But also the AI Catherine wasn't telling me what I wanted to know, because Catherine had their own objectives to deal with. And they were also very bad at it, which is not the... I'm realizing this now. It's not how I would have wanted my smart AI companion to act. Mm-hmm. And it's so easy to perceive Catherine as like, oh, sweet, I have an AI companion now? Dope. You can tell me everything I need to know. And that character was so not interested in me or my journey or anything that I was going on. Mm. It became really painfully obvious, especially towards... before we entered the abyss, especially, it was more like, sorry, I was not going to tell you this, but I screwed up. Like, I wasn't going to tell you that we're going to shut old Simon down. and oh my god, so infallible.
Yeah, at the very least, she could have given the forewarning and let Simon make the choice. Like, he could choose, like, hey, I still want to go ahead with this anyway, right?
Right. The game was determined to piss me off in my mind. Like, at least the kind of person I am. Not every player, but the kind of person I am. The game was determined to drag me through all of those choices I would not have made myself.
Sure.
And I would have like said, "Yo, turn this Simon back on. Let's go. Let's talk a little bit, and then this Simon and that Simon, we can decide some stuff, and we can make some agreements here at least." You know,
I think unfortunately that like I'm going to try and speak for the developers for a second. I kind of feel like maybe that would be stuff they would love to explore, but like how do you explore that in a video game? How do you start? Because then at that point, what do you have, like dialogue choices or something? It would be difficult to pull off in a way that would feel convincing and not start to feel a bit immersion breaking.
I feel like the Simon that I had was so average. He would have been like, "Well, you're the one that's got to go down there.
True.
Maybe you don't come back. So what do you want to say before you go?"
That's true.
Like I think there's beats they could have hit, but I understand why they didn't. They were working towards the ending.
Yeah.
Ostensibly, right? And the ending was always pretty much going to be what it was. I think I sat there for almost 5 minutes just seeing if Catherine would get angry that I didn't shoot the gun to get the humans into space.
Yeah.
And she was like, "Anytime we're going to do this. Let's go. You ready?"
I really appreciate it they included those dialogue lines, but most people, I would say, would just press a button immediately. Like, let's go.
Yeah. I am Go ahead, sorry.
I wanted to bring up one point, because I want to get to gameplay sometime soon, but I want to bring up one final point that I've always found really fascinating is the ending, the post-credit scene and the ending itself. I've always found it interesting of which order was better. What if, as soon as you uploaded the mind, right, copied it, effectively, it played the post-credit scene as we know it now, and then it all ends happy, and then there's a post-credit scene which is actually waking up as Simon down on the in Pathos 2. It just flip the order, How would that feel? Like, what would the difference of the message be? And what would I guess the only problematic part of... So, what is interesting is when they did the original copy from the Simon in the chair to the new suit that they had to go in the Abyss to, they decided as game designers, game developers, that they wanted the perspective of the player to shift to the copy. And then the ending, they're like, no, we're going to do the reverse now. We're going to show, okay, this is what it's actually like. This is what it's like. It's the other side of the coin. You didn't get to, like, whether or not you philosophically believe in the idea of flip of the coin, from the player's perspective, that's what happens. You lose the coin costs,
Right.
So I guess that's why they had to do it in the way that they did. And also, it thematically feels a lot better. I mean, apart from it being a horror game, I think it just... The themes play a little bit better. But it's interesting.
I would like to propose, let's go off into wild experimental land for a second. I think of A Tale of Two Brothers and A Way Out, the Haze Light games.
Yeah, I loved A Tale of Two Brothers. Great game.
Their office is right below the Mojang
Yeah,
Studios
I haven't got a chance to meet any of them, but I've heard.
Yeah, I would have loved to. I think I missed the day that they came to visit. What if it was side by side and you controlled both characters? But let's take it a step further. What if the inputs you gave to one ending sequence, you get replayed back to you, but you have no autonomy over the movement at that point? It takes the recorded inputs and then plays the sequence from... I know this would be impossible to design. I just want to imagine it in my head. You move through the environment. It's the same 3 environments, but in like on the Ark, in the Abyss, and then where the last copy of Simon woke up.
Right.
And you can see kind of you did the same thing each time, but it had different effects and different outcomes. I think that would be an interesting part of the story to feel that, yeah, you're still the same Simon, like from a Ludo narrative standpoint, but that's not like all three of these Simons are going to have a very different experience where they diverge and then perhaps even they take over. And you realize like, oh yeah, I am disconnected. I actually don't know which one I am, because some of these I did do, some of this I didn't do.
To me, that would definitely hit even harder on the whole environment makes everything statement, at least in me, because it's like you're doing the exact same thing, completely different environments, your experience is entirely different. I guess the only reason against that sort of idea would be you're not in control, and I think something they wanted to really hammer home is that like these are two different people, and they each have different autonomy. So if it had the same actions across two different people, it doesn't really give the message that they're trying to give, which is that they're two different people at this point. It's an interesting idea.
Maybe the concept's dead in the water. Yeah. It's a little dead in the water, I think, because you can't even create a relation between them. If you do, then that's what the player's going to think. You can't go one way and then the other one goes the opposite way, because that's still supposing one has an effect on the other when at this point they have no effect. Yeah. It doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, and I think also from a narrative perspective, I do, like, they obviously did try to make some statements in this game, but I think they also tried to stay pretty agnostic to what they were saying in the game at the same time. Like, I think if they tried to be too artsy with the ending, they wouldn't have let the player who just played the game to come up to their own conclusions of what they felt about the whole story and the whole game. If they leant too heavy into their own statement, maybe it would have been... maybe it would have detracted from that. Like, even Simon, you know, probably having potentially a different opinion from the player is a way of them staying agnostic to a degree, right? Because it's quite obvious that Simon is a character and a person of their own. It won't match with the player, which there's arguments for and against, but I think that for me, that made me feel that, like, everyone is going to have a different perspective of what this game actually means. Yeah.
So interesting. I still want in my head, and I think from now until I even see it for real, my headcanon is going to be... How do I say this? My headcanon will be that the Simon that was in the gunner chair and the Catherine went back up, and he shook that other Simon awake.
Right.
And then the game ends. Hard cut. For me, that's how the game ends in my head now, because I need that. Because like, what do you? I want a little bit of thought of what do you do when the person you sent something to space and you're at the bottom, the most central, like the almost to the center of the Earth. As close as you can get. You're literally buried under all of the weight of what you've done.
To be fair, to go out on a limb here, is that not how the game actually ends? Because after the credits roll, we don't know what Simon does down there, and I think it's entirely up to the player what he does.
I just wanted to see it. I wanted to feel that. That would have broken my heart. To see that.
Yeah, I feel that, but I think there's also something special about not showing things sometimes, because your picture of what you just explained, of like him shaking the other Simon's hand, right? That might not be what I would want from the perfect ending to the game, right? So isn't it actually kind of good that they kind of leave it in a way that really, I mean, Simon's not dead at the end of the game. He's there, he's alone. It's very depressing. But who knows what he does after this, you know? And really interestingly, it all depends on your choices throughout the game. Because if you killed the whale, then maybe there's not much else you can do. But maybe if you didn't kill the whale, maybe there's some way you could collaborate with it. I don't know. There's a lot of things. And actually, we should probably get into the choices you made
Yeah.
in the game, actually. And this is coming from a gameplay
Yeah.
perspective of... So, you played all the Telltale games, right?
I did. I did play a lot of them. Almost
Did
all of
you...
them. Well, not the Walking Dead series would be accurate to say, and then Life is Strange.
Right, yeah. Life is Strange wasn't Telltale.
No,
yeah, but the same sort of genre.
These are the standouts.
Yeah,
right?
definitely. I actually immensely enjoyed Walking Dead, and I immensely enjoyed Life is Strange. I don't know how you feel about them, but I actually really enjoy them.
I didn't like the second one until Kenny showed up. Once Kenny showed up, I was like, I can get back on board of this game. But I felt the second season in itself was it didn't uphold the same standards and difficult choices that I felt. It felt like it had a central morality behind the writers in the second.
Was that Life is Strange or Walking Dead?
Walking
Okay.
Dead. Life is Strange, I thought was good top to bottom.
Yeah, I never played the
think
second
every-
Life is Strange though. Wasn't
You play a couple brothers
Huh? Okay.
in the around the same time the other things are happening. It's very interesting.
Well, I guess what I wanted to say is while I immensely enjoyed those games, I've always had a huge problem as a designer with these games because they're fun to play. Don't get me wrong. They're actually really enjoyable experiences. But they obviously very heavily, they lend a hand from television. They're literally called episodes in The Walking Dead,
Right.
which of course kind of also a little bit makes sense because there's a Walking Dead TV show as well, even though it's not the same narrative. I dislike... There is criticism to be made by all the choices that you can make in any of those games, like The Walking Dead, because to me, I've always felt like any choice you make in a Walking Dead game or any sort of game like that, because of the inherent reality of scope, you can't really make anything have a genuine impact on the narrative or on the storytelling. There are only like maybe one big choice in the game that actually makes a big impact. It might be like, oh, one character ends up staying alive and the other one dies, but then they end up dying at the end of the season anyway, so it doesn't really make a difference. And this is another problem. If it spans multiple different seasons or multiple different games, any choice you make realistically can't span over a season. Not in a big way, because then the narrative has to diverge so hard that they're completely two separate games, and then, or even more with the multiple choices, to the point where, any sane developer cannot actually develop these different narratives with the respect that they would deserve. And this is actually what, of course it might not be what we ideally want as developers or even as gamers, but I actually really respect and applaud the developers of Soma for giving choices that have so much impact, in my opinion at least, but not on the narrative in the sense of like consequences down the line, but of consequences to who you are as a person. And even more than that, these choices have an impact in the narrative, but they're not shown, they're implied. So you killing the WoW, because at the end of the game, you're left with Simon, alone, and you don't know what happens after. You, as a player, get to determine what may or probably would have happened after that as a consequence of you either killing or not killing the WoW. Or, for example, letting the robot, I can't remember which station it was in front of, but the one where you get to, she thought she was on the Ark, and you get to either, pull the plug or let her live in her ignorance.
Right, Rose.
Yeah. To me, I think that's so strong, because I think it shows as designers, we don't need to show the consequences in like a narrative plot-driven way for the game, for the player to feel like they have agency on the world. Of course, part of it supposes that you need to buy into the narrative and to the world that you're playing. But I don't think that you have to actually show those consequences later on for that to really make a difference. And I don't think this is just done for scope reasons. I think that it's more immersive that way as well. That's at least in my opinion. I don't know how you felt about it.
I do feel some kind of way about it. Oh, geez, I have to readjust in my seat about this. Huh. Okay. I would. The first point I want to make is I don't think the impact of making the decisions you make, of what Carl versus Simon in The Walking Dead, or do you kill that dumbass kid or you don't? I would, going back, I might have killed him now because I already tried to save him once. Do you tell Kenny off or not? It creates an experience for the player of wondering what might have happened, and maybe why it's weaker for us, and is because we see behind the curtain, so to speak.
Yeah.
We as soon as anything action that happens to a player, or sorry, to a character, I'm correlating. I'm thinking about when were they last acted upon, how much longer until they have to hit that next beat that allows them to grow or change as a character. So there's a lot of this outside observation, and then the next beat is like, oh, if they had decided to do this, or we had decided to help them here, they would have done this, and now we can't. So I have to do this.
Yeah.
That for me is the full benefit of that experience. I don't think it weakens or strengthens the core. It lives or dies on the merit of what it makes the player feel like.
Yeah.
And I don't want to hold it up. I don't want to hold it up against something like Soma, where ostensibly we correlate the same thing. Either we make this choice or we don't make this choice, and it affects our perception of how we see the rest of the game or the narrative from an almost agnostic sense, I think is what you kept saying during the game. There's like, the world is very uncaring, but we're shaping how you, the player, feel about the world, which is a different kind of experience they're going for.
I guess the difference, and I really liked the way you described it, which is like seeing behind the curtains. I think I could tell that a lot more with The Walking Dead, because they tried to keep up this illusion that your choices mattered through plot rather than through like intrinsic beliefs. As soon as you saw like choosing whether or not to save a character ends up in that saved character dying at the end of the season, it felt like my choice didn't matter at all. There was no choice. At least with Soma, while yes, it is the same thing technically, I think the difference is that they never show you the consequence of that choice, so there is no seeing behind the curtain. I guess you could, like, again, as designers, we see behind the curtain all the time. We can see that, you just make a choice and literally nothing matters at all.
But this isn't entirely true, is it? They play a different kind of game. It's the same deal, but they hide it in a different.
They hide it in a different way, yeah. And I guess what I'm saying is I respect the way they hit it in that way. And it also, to be honest, it's easier to design. Well, not easier to. It's harder to design, but easier to develop on production.
The methodology is still just as. I hesitate to say cheap, but it is cheap in the sense that it is not difficult to reproduce.
Yeah. Yes.
It is easily replicable, which is make the player make a decision and then introduce a story plot afterwards, or an element that makes them recontextualize the decision they made. And then give them that later in a different way, and then keep recontextualizing it if it's valuable to do to the story.
I'd say it's cheap on the surface, but much, much more difficult if it's actually a decision you want the player to care about whatsoever. I think the choices in Soma that you had were much, much harder to design than the choices you had in The Walking Dead. It's very easy to design, do you kill this character or not kill this character, and they will live for the rest of the game or whatever. I think it's a lot more difficult to get someone to care about something that you're never going to see the consequences for later. The narrative design.
About these characters at the end. What character did I care about in Soma the most? I really hated Catherine. I think Catherine was the one that like upset me, but not to the end that I cared about my opinion of her. I cared about what I felt about her and what I thought she was going to do. And I was most active in working with and thinking about Catherine and responding to her as understanding what Simon thought of her and understanding what I thought of her. I think the one that hit me the most, and maybe we talked about this while I was playing, was the robot that felt like it was still alive, but it was disassociating.
Yeah.
It was totally out of I felt the worst about that, and when I was given the choice to pull that chip out, it was no hesitation. I rushed over there. I chased that thing down. I tried to min-max it, speed run it to pull the chip out. Because I felt so strongly that that was the worst existence you could live in. And then the second one was Rose believing she made it to the Ark. This is the Ark. This is what she's experiencing. And from the outside perception, that was the reality, that I would definitely try to shut that down or show her the truth. Simon decided to show empathy.
Yes.
I didn't agree with that as a player, so there was a ludonarrative dissonance between what Simon was saying and what I actually did. If Simon felt that way, I shouldn't have never been able to have the chance to pull Rose's plug.
Yeah. That's always going to be hard to get by. Like, you can't destroy all ludonarrative dissonance in a game unless we have like machine learning AI that can actually generate stories for us based on like a given prompt.
That one stood out to me because I mean he was being empathetic, wasn't he? He was like, "Oh, I'm so happy to see you again, my son. I'm dying. I'm not your son. Okay, maybe I'm your son. You're in a happy place now, and all your friends are by you. Aren't you happy?"
Right.
And then you pull the plug anyway. Like, either you leave him in that state, and then someone else comes by and ruins that, or you end it. Like, at least all I can say is Simon gave her a good ending. I wanted her to see the truth.
Yeah.
And I was not given that opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that's just a decision that was probably made earlier in the design process, that they wanted these characters to be fully fledged characters. They didn't want you to play as what is somewhat of a silent protagonist. Even if you didn't make it a silent protagonist, if the character had no opinions, strong opinions of anything, then it's not a character. Not in what I would consider a traditional sense. Like, for example, I don't consider Morgan Freeman a character. I consider him an avatar. I consider him a consequence of his actions, and that is the player's, but he's not a character.
You mean Gordon Freeman?
Did I say Morgan Freeman? Oh my God. Gordon.
And I was like, wow.
Yeah, Morgan Freeman, he's not a character. He's not even real. He's not alive.
He's a voice entity that is deeper than us all.
Yeah, I meant to say Gordon Freeman from Half-Life.
I have a question for you. I think maybe we can talk on this and then we'll have our time. If you came across as an entity in space, and then you came across what was ever remained separately, not at the same time, not one after another, but each in their own chamber, their silo. If you came across the Ark floating in space and you realized humanity was living a life inside that Ark, would you try to bring them out? Would you hope from the inside out and the outside in? What would you try to do with that? And then, what if the stuff did evolve and it's a whole other thing?
Oh man.
And you've heard of humanity. Let's start with the Ark. Maybe just the Ark question, because I think running across the WoW and whatever evolution is would be just as new as running against a new society. What do you do with that?
Who am I? Ark. Am I a human?
You are an entity that came out of space. You are a traveling civilization, and you came across this thing. You pick up a distress signal, and then you start digging into this technology, and you realize there's consciousness or something that we would consider life inside of this.
So if I was an empathetic race,
and the request was to be brought back, right? To be saved in some way, I think was what the distress signal would be, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really...
this is humanity?
What, are you saying that the Ark is sending a distress signal?
I think the Ark wants to be found. That's why they sent it out there, right? So humanity can live on.
It definitely has a chance, yeah. I guess it really depends on how long the Ark has been out there. Like, if I could do something, I would interface with the Ark and the people inside of it to ask them if they want to come out. if they could be uploaded into androids or something, if that's something they'd want, I would love if I could give them the ability to have consent, right? But I wouldn't do it without their consent, because who's to say that they don't love living the ignorant bliss that they've been in? I mean, let's say they've been living in there for 1,000 years.
Have they forgotten by then? Are we in the Matrix question now already? Jeez.
Yeah, I mean, well, they could have forgotten, or even if they didn't forget, what if they become so comfortable in it? You know, do they really want to come into a life that's even more unfamiliar to them than what they've already become used to for so many years? Like, is there something that would be favorable for them? I don't know. Like, and also, but then again, here's another flip side to it. Maybe it would be absolute torture living in something that you can never get out for like 1,000 years and potentially more.
How long until the humans inside try to hack the system? Then, because I think if they perceive some kind of prison, isn't that the common story that humanity wants to break free? But they're already aware that they are inside of a ark floating in space. They're the ones that made it to the presupposed utopia. It's
interesting, right? I think I've always thought of like what could I would actually never want a sequel for Soma, but if they ever did a sequel, they could either do something with one of the Simons down, in Pathos 2, or they could have a story within the ark. Something has got to go. The society in the ark cannot be perfect. Something has to go wrong. People don't just play along forever. I mean, if they're in there for 2,000 years, someone's going to disagree eventually. And what if they do have a way to interface with the ark and hack it? Like you said, like anything could go wrong. Or it could be literally the scenario you're talking about, that an alien civilization finds it and starts to do some weird shit. Like what if they,
Ooh, this is a good battery for my car.
Something like that. I don't know. They could do anything. They could even, put themselves inside the ark in order to try and speak with humanity. There's so many things that like potential storylines there. I don't think it would be a great game, to be honest, but it's interesting to think about. What would you do if you were the entity?
I don't know. I've always liked the idea of Star Trek's Federations. The first Prime Directive is what they called it, where they don't interact with a society that's not ready to be interacted with.
Right.
I find that even breaking into it and having some line of communication over 2,000 years, what is the quality of that data? Was there any degradation? Has there been hurt in there?
Yeah.
I would want to check, and at least I think I could determine fairly quickly. I would try to run diagnostics to see where we're at with it. There's some kind of perverse looking into a tiny universe.
It's curiosity
is what it is, right? And then trying to figure out how to best do it. I feel like I would almost try to default to making contact, to assessing where you come from. Do you have any perception of what time is? When did you launch in your years and things? All of that, if I could determine these things, would color how I would approach the society. But I think at my core, I'd want them to have an honest assessment of where they are and and how long it's been. Mm-hmm. I don't know if the flow of time could really go inside the arc. How have they put this down? Has it really only been a day or two for them? Has it been more? Are they getting reset? Is there some, we could reset entire scenarios. The arc could get reset.
Yeah, and we don't know all the details of it.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing to think about, like whether or not time runs faster or slower in the arc compared to the real world.
Yeah.
It could run faster or slower. If it runs slower, then 1,000 years in the real world might only be 100 for them. That would be some more time travel there.
Yeah, and can you imagine the sky change? Any part of data could be changed. You're oh look, we see what we look like data things and what they we assume they programmed into the sky to communicate with each other. Suddenly clouds become a different shape and image and become horrific from the ground down perception. All of these like elements of that are world shaking. And we're also, I think, like maybe I didn't hear it in your message, but in my mind that they evolve or somehow they live, they grow, they adapt in some way, because that's what humanity does as an algorithm of humanity, of data, and what the data, I suppose, it wants to keep running.
Yeah.
We're not static data. We're up in the RAM. We're up in the runtime, aren't we? We're being modified. We're being a little dynamic in some way.
For sure. Okay, well, should we maybe get into some gameplay? A little bit.
We have not yet talked about gameplay?
I would say we have talked about gameplay, but it's like heavily intertwined with the narrative.
For me, all of this is the gameplay.
It is.
For me, like,
and maybe that's a topic in of itself, right?
Yeah, the actual movement, the interactions, the other parts of it were the weakest part of the trying to interface with this game. Was I've chalked it up to a feature of Simon being out of time. And the choices they made, if we don't think of it from an engine level where they wanted to do full physics and all these things and wanted to interact and create a world that ostensibly doesn't care about you, is all, for me, indicative of what the engine is capable of, and less so about reinforcing the story. Like, I was doing Quake-like bunny hopping and jumping just because I was allowed to do it at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, what stands out about gameplay? Like, we can talk about all the different elements. For me, the everything we've been talking about was the gameplay of it, the thinking of it, the experience of it was so more impactful than how I felt when I walked up to a ladder and couldn't press spacebar to move
Yeah,
up.
for sure. I mean, I think it's all very intertwined. I think like the narrative is the gameplay. It's, to me, I don't say this lightly, but I feel like it's the most interwoven game I've ever played between narrative and gameplay. Personally, maybe there's games I haven't played, but I felt like Simon. I felt like the story I was being told and experiencing was real. I felt like every sort of quote-unquote mechanic was part of what I would do in real life versus, oh, I need to do this because the game needs that challenge. As much as it possibly can. Like you said, there were some elements where, like, oh, when you had to do the shopping list sort of quest, like, that felt a little more gamey. Right. But for the most part, they did a very good job of everything feeling like this is what I would need to do because of the history and the environment and the narrative versus this is what the game designers wanted me to do because they needed to pad out the difficulty of the game or the length of the game or something like that. But there are some things that can be discussed, like, for example, monsters and what they serviced in the game, like what was their purpose for the gameplay, or, I mean, we already went over puzzles, and I agree that I think they're pretty good. They're pretty good because they mostly didn't feel like puzzles.
No, they felt very much in world. I think everything you've indicated is can be summed up as like everything is in world, and uncaring is incorrect to say. Not concerned would be more accurate until they have to concern themselves with you.
Exactly.
And that separation was very interesting to me. But I have to admit, and maybe I said this once during play, I thought you're very generous to the developers. You bend over backwards, I felt, to explain away some things that very much could have been we're running out of time, let's ship this kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
And to some aspect I can see how they had such a strong base they can take these choices. And in some other cases, I think like being in the sewers and climbing that giant tower, totally unnecessary to the story. It felt like,
although I don't remember
unnecessary to the
that.
character moment. No, not at all. I'm thinking more so. I just grabbed at one that I thought about. I wish I could I felt this throughout the time playing the game. That was just a bad experience that I was like, we don't have to, we can agree that this part was like, Half-Life.
Yeah, I mean, like, there are some examples, like, for example, ladder interaction and stuff, like, I give them slack because I know that the engine is in-house. That doesn't mean that I think it's a perfect choice for the game. I think I see it more as like I'm a game developer, I'm a game designer, I know what it's like when your engine or what you want to do is not necessarily what you can do. So it's more like I give them credit for where things kind of seem like it's just the way it is. It's not like I get more angry when I see something that it would be a conscious decision that I'm like, that just doesn't work for the game. You know, that doesn't enhance the experience. But when it's a decision which I know and I can tell at least that they're the decisions that were forced onto them because of engine or scope limitations, I'm like, yeah, I can forgive them for that. And that's where I agree, but I also think that I'm forgiving only for the things that can be forgiven.
Yeah, and I was a little more stringent about it. I was a little less forgiving, and I think this is probably a bit of trauma of having reviewed hundreds and hundreds of ostensibly indie games over the last 3-4 years, and then playing a lot of games that have taken these mechanics or have iterated on these mechanics in different ways.
Yeah.
So for me, that was the harder part to rationalize, because I fight so hard for a high standard in service for the story, and where we disagreed, I think, is where we disagree on what line of what was good enough. Or I felt that was a conscious decision, and then you explained it in world and narrative in some way, and some points were very valid, and some points I was like, I could see that, but like, I'm not trying to press that point.
Yeah,
It's an in-house engine. They do the best they can with what they have and then move on. I felt like there is flaws to the game that are deep, but they do not, almost never do they detract from the narrative of the game. They pull me out of the immersion of the game, would be more accurate to say. I still feel they're very much in service to, or at least they're unaffecting of the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear about those points, because that's interesting.
I think the progression of monster types was the big outstanding bit to me. I wanted to have more interaction with the crew that was left over and the ones that were still upright and walking, but throwing something didn't affect meaningful choice to the character. And because I had no relation or understanding of what some of these monsters that could see me or could not see me, hear me, not hear me, I felt like very detached and very not detached in a robotic, I'm a mechanoid kind of way, more so in a I don't need to concern myself with you at all kind of way.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of you. I don't care about you, and not because you got tripped up on some physics or you couldn't walk around the corner. But I threw a can expecting you to walk away because you have almost always been attentive to noise, and then you don't do anything when I do that, and you keep standing there next to me, like,
yeah.
That's what messes me up. But if I walk into that can, then you're running over to me. That's what the thing that really frustrated me, that I felt could have been addressed in a gameplay sense.
Yeah, no, I, funnily enough, actually completely agree with this. And it is one of the criticisms of the game in the wider community. So I guess I'll pre-phrase this with... And
I want to hear what you want to say, but for me, that was the big sticking point where I brought this up, I think once or twice specifically about monsters. And you brought up the counterpoint that of course they're just not caring about you. They're not trying to act in any particular way. They are their own autonomous beings. And for me, that was the explaining away part that I disagreed with.
Yeah.
Well, I couldn't disagree with the sentiment, right?
Yeah. there are two topics there, but I'll get to what I was going to say first, and then I'll go back to that because I think it's interesting. And we've already talked about it a little bit, but we may as well talk about it here. So, first of all, I do think that these monsters are far better than the ones in Amnesia in terms of breadth of mechanics and like them actually serving a purpose in the story and being very, very interconnected with the narrative. And I think even in terms of just like, sure, maybe the visuals maybe are not as interesting and maybe they're not as scary, but I think they were much more interesting characters than the ones in Amnesia, which were just more like, let's get as scary as we can. Let's get as like a horror genre as we can.
I remember all the characters in Soma, and I have to say I remember nothing but shadows and breathing in Amnesia.
Yeah.
And maybe the final guy, but not really.
Yeah.
It's a blur in my head.
But that's the thing. Amnesia, it leans into this. It leans into the unknown as much as possible. Whereas Soma, you're literally grappling with the narrative in terms of these characters and these monsters. Whereas Amnesia doesn't want you to see these monsters. It wants you to hide from these monsters. It actively has closets in the game as a mechanic where you hide behind the closet and just peek a little bit to see a tiny bit. Whereas you see something like what are they called? The proxies in Soma, which are the ones that couldn't hear. They were just like the wobbling, writhing things. You're seeing them most of the time. You can turn on your flashlight. You can see them basically in what I'd consider broad daylight, which instantly makes them less scary. They're just a less scary creature because of that, because then they're not unknown anymore. They're very known, and you can see all their flaws. You can see all their AI flaws. But that's also the strength of the game at the same time. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that while I believe there were way more monsters in this game, each monster was very different. Like, you had the original robot, which you only saw for a little bit, which I also liked. I'm complimenting a lot, but I want to get to a negative point. I really like the fact that every time you saw a monster, for the most part, it was a new one. You maybe saw the proxies the most, but you saw the robot, then you saw the one that had like weird flashing lights on its head and you couldn't look at it. Then you saw the proxy, and then you saw Acres, which was like a really like almost buffed up version of a proxy. And
what was the proxy doing again? Was that the sonar one?
The proxy was the one that could only hear; it couldn't see. It was the one that had writhing tentacles on it, and it was like jiggling.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with that monster.
Yes, definitely spent a lot of time with it, and I would actually say that it was probably the weakest in the sense that it probably should have only been shown once. They showed it too much because you got too familiar with it. Like, you should have seen it once and then that's it, and they should have either moved on to an entirely new monster or mechanic or chose a different one. Like, I found the one that you couldn't see much scarier, both in its audio and just sort of the way that you deal with it. So I compliment all of that, but it all comes down to the fact that I think the monsters are just the weakest part of the game because while it adds to the narrative, I just think that it almost felt a bit too gamey. It's like either they should have lent into that heavily and made it so that the AI was super responsive, like you said, like you threw a can and it would immediately like charge towards it. Like, if the proxy was going to be a big part of the game and it was going to be the monster you saw the most, it should have been the most spot on in terms of AI, in terms of the way that it moved around and the way in terms of how it navigated in the environment. But it was kind of sloppy. Like, the AI is pretty jank, and yeah, I think that they could have absolutely done so much better on that. It doesn't detract from the game. I think it's still a great game, but if they nailed that, like, wow, it would have been an even better game, you know?
I feel I want to hear your second point, so hold on to that thought, because we have two topics to discuss here, right? How I felt about the monsters was one of two ways: either hide or run from it.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Yeah.
That was my interaction with the monster, which for me is why it was the weakest part of the game. I had no care. If a monster saw me, I'm like, okay, I'll run around the level. And I built such a mental map that it was often not a problem for me to get back into the hiding state.
Yeah.
And that was perhaps the most frustrating part. I had no mind to memorize a monster's movement, so therefore they didn't hit me the same way that the scrap monster outside stuck in their loop was. So that there was a break in empathy towards the monsters and the robots, where there should have been something stronger, where I could have an observable, identifiable track that the monster goes on. If it's that kind of monster, maybe they are working towards goals, or maybe they're disassociating and remembering something that they have to do over and over and over again.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. There were some monsters where I felt like, maybe empathy is the wrong word, but kind of like an emotional link to. For me, maybe that was Akers. I think that he got built up. He was interesting. He was an interesting character, and to see the slow unturning of him going insane and hearing all the voice recordings when you finally meet him, to me, it was really cool. But when I see...
Could you imagine?
When I see, like, the proxies, I don't really... Their AI and behavior, other than, again, their animation and their audio, yes, it conveys, like, pain and suffering, but I didn't see that in their behavior, in the way that they navigated. They felt like robots, and not in the good kind, not in the, oh, this is a robot and this is a this is part of the narrative, like, oh, they're robots. This is more like, oh, they felt like programmed AI in a video game, and I don't feel like they're actually real creatures. I would have loved to, maybe especially leaning into horror, you know, maybe you could kind of glean some of the past self of what that person used to be, you know? Imagine if it kind of had elements of the past person's personality in some way. Maybe they were fixated on some things, you know? Like, there's interesting things that they could have played with, and I'm sure maybe they would have liked to play with it if they had more time to develop it, but I think it's a missed opportunity that those creatures, I didn't feel the human connection, even in the sense of how they're not human anymore, you know?
Yeah. Like, if we walk around and then, like, I have two things that would have made this great for me. Seeing the eye monster at the beginning, the flashing lights one that you can't look at, breaking mirrors, or hearing the shattering of mirrors and glass and shit going through. Yeah. Would have made me think some kind of way about it. But more specifically, I would have loved to see Akers and Ross kind of having interactions where, you know, maybe we have to follow Akers for a little bit. We have to read an audio log or something. Or like, okay, this is where I think they're going. This is what they're doing. And then Ross comes through like, boo, and scares Akers in some way or affects them. Maybe not even scares, it's too simple. Maybe it causes them to think a different way. Or a monster is trying to hit through every terminal, and they find they can't get access to one because of some reason, so they smash it and go to the other. And suddenly we have to be like, okay, how many terminals are left and what do we do now? Yeah. That, to me, ties the environment to the gameplay, to the audio logs. When I say gameplay, I mean my interactions with the monster. Yeah. In a much stronger way, which for me, again, was, I don't think of the environment, and I don't think of the monsters, and I don't think of the audio logs almost as part of the same game. And that is strictly on implementation. Narrative wise, that, like, if I think about it as a story to tell someone, it all fits together. But I didn't feel the same way about monsters that I felt about the story, that I felt like I had to check things off in an audio log just to milk the narration out of the game, because the rest of it wasn't given it to me. I should have been able to walk into a room and be like, this is full of broken cans and glass, so if I walk here anywhere, this monster is going to have a problem with me, so I have to start pulling this stuff out of the way. Never happened in a game. Happened maybe in Amnesia, but not in a great way.
No.
I can remember a couple things that you have to stay out of the water, but
Yeah, that's kind of the interesting thing about Soma and Amnesia is I almost felt like Soma was very hell-bent on not straying too far from Amnesia, and Amnesia was basically the same thing, run and hide. And they didn't do anything more than that in Soma. And I think maybe that was kind of its downfall. They tried to play it up a little bit by not having things like closets in Soma, but I don't think that like to make it like, oh, now you can't hide anymore, not in the same way that you did in Amnesia. And I think that was interesting, but I think they didn't go far enough. Like I think they one thing that was always interesting is like with Acres in that section, they through audio cues and probably like some sort of subsystem in the background, they played it up that he's moving through the vents. You can hear up above.
right.
But I would thought that would have been much more cool if it was actually real. And, you know, games like Alien Isolation, which I haven't played, but I've seen a lot of gameplay of, it does that. The alien actually moves through the vents. And unfortunately, you know, maybe, again, this engine is old and in-house, and of course it's got lots of updates and stuff, but it probably currently doesn't have the capabilities to do that sort of stuff. And it sucks because I really think that if they had more advanced AI in all of their games, they would be like masterclass. I think they are masterclass at horror, but I think like they would be like unbeatable because that's like really their flaw in frictional games. I think all of their games just have like poor AI behind them. I like once you unveil the curtain, you just see AI. I don't know.
It's also their adherence to the systemic design they have. Those monsters, I feel like they maybe had a nav mesh and shit to go through for sure.
Probably, yeah.
But I think the company or maybe the developer, frictional games, let's just say it like that, were a bit hell-bent on their way, their methodology, their way of implementation, when in some cases a more scripted event would have sold the same story and the same gameplay, and then they can go back and forth between the two. They have this additional design tool, and perhaps they handcuff themselves a little bit by not allowing some more of that into their monsters, and then going out of it like, okay, you go do the scripted event, but then you're set free after that, or you'll get set free if something weird happens.
Yeah, like as long as the scripted event is only to the monster and not the player. Like I don't want it to start having things like the player's control being taken. But if it's like, a scripted event of a monster going in a room and like literally turning over cabinets and stuff, like that would be cool. I'd love that. That would be amazing. But again, maybe it comes down to resources. Like, I mean, it is an indie company. I don't know. I think they're bigger now, but I guess there's only so much they can do, but damn, would that be cool. I would love to see Acres go crazy in that section. I think it was very much just chasing you. Very creepy creature and character, but they're just like, go all out. Let's have it doing some pretty disgusting, horrific things. Show the craziness and madness of the character that we read in the logs, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that would be so key to me to bring everything together.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think in the end, I think we're in agreement. Like the monsters are the weakest part of the game.
Yeah,
but not to the point that it ruins the game. But it's just like they're almost just complementary things to glue the game together. Not necessarily like I wouldn't go up to someone and say, "Oh, you got to play Soma because like the monsters, wow, like the way you navigate around them is so cool." Like I wouldn't do that. I would be talking about the narrative and the story. It would be the last thing I would talk about, probably.
I absolutely agree. But then when we talk about this, we talk about this as the game.
Yeah.
This is the part of the experience of the game, but we never discussed what was the weak side of the game that we need to compensate for. Mm-hmm. So that's the experience I had when I went through.
Yeah.
This is how I'm perceiving the game, because I want to feel that I'm not the only one that has agency in the world, even if it's faked. I want a little hint of it, you know? And Catherine had the most agency.
Yes.
but she was also driving the plot forward. She didn't have the same kind of agency we talked about when we make character choices that don't matter.
No.
Well, to the narrative, but they matter to the player. They define who you are as a person.
Yeah, definitely.
I would have much preferred that.
Yeah, they kind of made us smart.
I really like this game.
I'm glad. I was just going to say that I think they made a smart decision making Catherine just in a box and not a walking robot, because that would have been terrible. They wouldn't have been able to pull it off. If they can't pull off the monsters, they can't pull her off, right?
I enjoyed how much of a hard reset she was on narrative beats. They controlled the pacing with her quite well.
Yeah.
It was always a pleasure and a moment of relief to plug her in and figure out what I'm doing next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so yeah, what did you think of the game in the end?
In the end, I don't know if I can recommend this game because of the experience with the monsters.
Right.
Of the story, I think it's valuable to talk about and valuable to experience if you want to feel what kind of person you are. I figured out where I felt the story was going, and then I decided what my part wanted to be in it. I think around Delta, perhaps even like at the second area, I think, where we discovered the robot flying around with the floating platform, that getting into the Zeppelin. I determined then how I wanted to react to the WoW and how much I wanted to succumb to it. And I decided I was going to go all in. So I started using the buttholes, the health regen. Wow, we made it through an hour and a half in this podcast without saying the word butthole.
Yeah,
once.
I almost did, but I didn't.
Too bad. I had to break the seal a little bit. That, for me, I understood where I wanted to be in this narrative, and then I committed myself to doing that, which means I felt more immersed, and I felt that I wanted to drive the story to that way. Which felt good as agency. I started fighting against the game more when I determined that Simon wouldn't let me have as much agency as I wanted, and I was kind of stuck in this body of this bookstore buffoon from Toronto, Canada, who very much just wanted to not die from a brain injury.
Yeah, what a rough life, huh?
Yeah, and once I realized that, and you asked me how I felt about the game, this is how I felt about the game going through it. I had a range of it. I wanted to be the character the game wanted me to be until I realized that I couldn't be what I presumed it was getting at, and I had to very much accept that I am embodying this character who is not able to grapple with the situation like I would have.
Yeah.
And then the game brought me along with it for the rest of it.
Yeah.
And it was a break, it was a disconnect, and that for me was hard to go along with as well as the monsters. So for me it's hard to recommend this game like that. But I enjoyed my time with it. And especially the time that you and I spent together with it.
So, as a interesting question for you, how would you say that compares to, for example, playing something like The Walking Dead? Would you not say that you experienced that disconnect pretty damn quickly in The Walking Dead as well?
No, I didn't, because the conceit was never there. You were always going to play Lee and always have several choices to make that had key effects on the story. So it followed the adventure game genre and format more, the choose your own adventure format. So the genre is more defined to me than what this game was.
So how do you think that was different here? Because it's quite obvious, I would say, at least for me, at the get-go, you're playing Simon. And he is a person of his own. So is it for you that would you say you didn't know what to expect, and it's almost like it was a genre, I guess, of games that you haven't had a lot of experience?
Let's take it to television genres, because that I think is easier to decipher, right? One, I turn on a sitcom, I understand what I'm going to get.
Yep.
Whether or not I like it or I like the quality of it, The Walking Dead, as far as sitcom genres go, or just drama goes, it fits into all of the boxes it needs to, and then it pulls and makes its punches at the time that it would give me the most emotional impact. Going back into it again, I don't think I'll have the same experience with The Walking Dead again. I believe I would have a deeper experience with Soma if I played it again. Will I? I don't know if I'll play either of these games again. So the experience that I had with it were, to me, equally pleasurable in different ways, and it made me think in different ways at that time in my life when I played those.
Yeah.
I don't think I could play The Walking Dead again for the first time today, knowing what I feel or what I think about game design. But 5 years ago, I think when I played it, totally loved it. Totally was deep down into it. Now I desire something more than what Soma did, but with a sense of understanding of how I would fit into the story, not as a narrative element, but what the breadth of my agency is earlier.
I guess again
that's hard. It's a bit of a nebulous thing to say.
My question is more how would you say the game would need to telegraph that earlier?
They need to take Simon out of the house right away. They need to have him in an uncomfortable environment. So I would have started him in the hospital or an empty thing. And then you go to a darker area where that's maybe not bit. So you're entering into the unknown already. And then maybe you walk back out and you go to your apartment and go to sleep or something, as far as the thing. Or maybe you just like take a nap here and then you wake up in the chair. So there's this element of being thrust into something that you already don't know about, and the game's not going to hold your hand on it. And they made the pledge. They can make the pledge like that. The pledge in Soma, as it is right now, is you understand that you underwent something traumatic. You didn't even get to experience the trauma of it. You just know that it happened. And then you go, and then you have kind of this weird interaction in this empty office, and then you wake up in the future. Yeah. So to me, the beginning is the non sequitur. We haven't even addressed or care about ostensibly what the beginning was. Simon is not. It's not important who he was before here. So why did they build up the thing of him being in his apartment, of having this car crash, of having somewhat of a happy relationship with the doctor? Like, man, we really did want to help you. I'm sorry. And then this doctor went on to do something else. It all felt like it was not important to the major plot of the story, of the points that it wanted to make. And that's what hurt me. The pledge in The Walking Dead is a lot more straightforward. You are Lee in the back of a police car. You did something bad. It's not going to tell you what bad it is, but you have that in your back pocket now. So you can feel like a bit of a maverick. Like, maybe I'm going to do good. Maybe I'm going to do bad. I don't know what kind of Lee I'm going to be. Am I going to be too angry? Am I going to be too nice? Or am I going to find some way in the middle? And I know I'm going to upset people, but what people am I going to upset? Yeah. So the pledge was stronger for me in Walking Dead and Soma, but Soma carried out its narrative, I think, a lot stronger in the ways that we like, where I can discover myself and not Lee.
It's interesting, though, because to me, the telegraphing point was actually the intro. Before you wake up and you're having the nightmare of the car crash. Because to me, that immediately telegraphed that was, yeah. This is a person who has his own grievances already. And you start to read about how he's had, he gets a call from his doctor about the brain injury. To me, that immediately shocked me into, this guy, he's been through some stuff. He has his own character and own troubles to deal with. But again, I'm not saying that maybe they could have done it a different way. But to me, that's what immediately put me in the mode of I am playing a different character. Especially when he even talked to his friend on the train or the phone call. There's just small little moments to me that that signaled it to me. versus when you go into something like Amnesia and you immediately go in and they do, you know, the whole classic trope of you've forgotten everything.
Yeah.
So coming from a game like Amnesia and then going into Soma, I'm like, okay, this is an Amnesia. You know, we're not playing some guy who's forgotten everything. I'm not an avatar for this character to make a bunch of actions. I don't even really hear the character in Amnesia. So with Soma, with Simon, you know, I'm hearing him talk all the time. So it felt clear to me, but I guess I find it interesting that it didn't work for you. And as a designer, I wonder what they could have done to make that clearer, whether it's like making the Toronto life stronger at the beginning, maybe had some extra scenes.
They would have had to double up. If they want to keep the assets they have with the thing they have to double up that experience. So maybe I forget it and I did it wrong, or I have to do it again in some way, because that then ties the idea of having brain injury and amnesia to seeing the world in altered events and not trusting that about who you are and what you've done. They touched on it, but I don't feel at all that Simon was concerned with anything that came before when he woke up in the chair. It was more like, and I'm not even supposed to be here today, which hurt the narrative more. He was a man out of time when he very much should have been not trusting if any of this was real to start with. And then slowly coming to the acceptance, like, oh my God, I'm actually in a machine.
Yeah.
That maybe would have made it stronger.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. They could have just doubled down on it and made him even more of a character rather than going halfway, right? Yeah, okay.
I think I'm happy with this, you know. I think we can perhaps talk about Soma again another time, and I'm sure we're going to revisit this, but thanks for sitting down here with me, man.
Yeah, no worries.
Talking about this.
I really appreciated it. Super fun.
Yeah. We're going to do this again, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And that's where the podcast is. Right there.
Nice.